All right. This is Elena Smith. I'm with Susie Swat today, who is a key former staff member of the California legislature. And amongst your many other accomplishments, including working as a chief of staff and as a press secretary, you did the lion's share of the work in placing Evidence Code 1070 into the California Constitution.
Yes.
This interview is for the California State Library. Susie, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're more than welcome. I'm happy that we're going to discuss this issue.
I am so happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Can you start by telling me how you and your husband Steve met?
Yes, we were both at Berkeley, Cal Berkeley, and I was a freshman. School had not even started, and what happened was I had just pledged to a sorority, and our sorority was invited by Steve's fraternity to come over for a dance. We all went over, I met Steve, and that was it. And we were married not several, but a few years later.
Wow.
So, yes.
Love at first sight?
It actually was, yes.
Oh, that's cool. That
Yes.
is really cool. Were you always aiming to become a legislative staffer? How did you come to work for Jerry Lewis?
Well, what happened is after Steve and I were married, we moved to Los Angeles, which was difficult for me since I grew up in San Francisco, wasn't used such a large town. But what happened is Steve was a journalist and he had an opportunity for a position here in Sacramento. So we came up here. We only had one car, and so we moved downtown so I could walk around, be able to move around on my own when he was at work. And I just became very interested where we were living. There was a patio, and we would look at the Capitol building, for breakfast, for dinner, because we were in a high rise.
Okay.
So I was very interested in this. And Steve said to me then one time, he said, we'll only be in Sacramento for about 5 years, because that was eons ago. And so I thought, wow, I really want to work in the legislature. And I was working at Xerox Corporation, and I knew business was not for me. But I became friends with one of the salesmen, as well as his wife. And his wife happened to work in the letter writing section for Ronald Reagan when he was governor. So she called me one day, and she says, I just heard through a friend of a friend of a friend, there's an opening in Jerry Lewis's office. So the next day, I walked into the office, gave him my resume, and then I was called within 2 days, and they hired me. They said all they could promise was 2 months. So this was the end of October 1971, and I wanted to take it to get a foot in the door. And that was it. He hired me, and it was just wonderful. Jerry was a great person to work for. I remember during the interview, though, he said to me, he says, do you know shorthand? And I said, no, I don't. But I said, I've got other good qualities. And I think what happened is we kind of just came together because he went to UCLA and I went to Berkeley. There was kind of this, we understood one another. So I worked for him until 1978 when he was elected to Congress.
When you said because you worked for UCLA and Berkeley, how did that work in your favor? I thought there was a rivalry between the schools.
But there probably was, but it said something to both of us. He went to UCLA, I went to Berkeley. They were different. They were kind of different schools. Obviously, there was many more protests in Berkeley, but you could just kind of see we meshed together. It was very interesting to watch that.
That is awesome.
Yes.
That is really cool. What was Lewis like? Were there other legislators he had a close relationship with?
Oh, he was wonderful. He got along with everybody. He was a moderate Republican, but he got along with all the Democrats as well. And one of his key things was environmental legislation.
Okay.
And he was actually responsible for the South Coast Air Quality Management District, the creation of that. He also was involved with the gasoline vapor recovery system, where you were very careful to keep the fumes not in the air. And he also was very involved with child care.
Okay.
And 3 of his closest friends were Bob Beverly, Bill Bagley, and Bob Monaghan. And they were all Republicans. They did great things for California.
Oh, that is so cool.
Yes.
And he had friends across the aisle. What
Yes.
was his secret?
It was his personality.
Okay.
I mean, he was somebody that you could work with very easily, somebody who, honestly, I can't ever remember seeing get mad or anything.
Wow.
He was willing to compromise. He knew when the issues were important, what needed to be done, and he was willing to work with other people to accomplish that.
That is really cool. So how would you compare him to other legislators that you worked for? Because you had a long career with many legislators that you worked for.
Yes, he wanted to help his constituents, and that was always forefront for him. And he was less rigid politically. He could understand, you know, and work with people on both sides of the aisle, again, which doesn't always occur nowadays, unfortunately, but it was done back then. And he had a lot of Democratic friends on top of all the Republican friends.
Wow, that is really cool. So you started working in the legislature when you could count the number of women actively working as senators or assembly people?
There weren't, it was 1971, and there was not a female senator yet.
Wow.
That was not until 1976, the first female senator. But yes, this was a full-time legislature, which started in 1967.
Okay.
So it was still kind of new when I got there. But it was a men's club.
Oh.
So when I was there, when I first started, there were only 3 women legislators. They were all members of the assembly. And they were March Fong, Yvonne Brathwaite, and Pauline Davis. And they were all Democrats.
Okay. How did this affect you, being that there just weren't that many women?
I think it affected a lot of people in the building because I personally think that women were taken advantage of because of the lack of numbers of women there. And there wasn't anything like a women's caucus. There wasn't where you could go to a female who worked in the building and say, look, I'm having problems, some issues, and could you help me? This did not happen until later in the 70s, and clearly it became the forefront starting in the 1980s, much more.
Okay. So there just wasn't support, is what I'm hearing. Okay.
Yes, it was very different. I mean, things were, again, 67 is when you went to the full-time legislature, and so people did not know how to interact, and you did not have the women. And that was, I think, very important to other women who worked in the Capitol building.
Okay, so having women present later on helped.
Oh, yes.
But during this early period, there was just total lack of support.
You had nobody that you could go to.
Wow.
It was very different.
Yeah.
I mean, I was lucky the office that I worked for was very nice and all of that. But there were a lot of women who had no protection.
Okay.
And so that made the job much more difficult. I felt sorry for a lot of people when things would occur that not to their liking.
Yeah, and I'm sure there were a lot of instances.
Yeah.
Would you like to elaborate on those, or would you like to move on? I do understand either way.
You know, it was very interesting. Just to give you a little bit of a background, in the 70s, most of the women were secretaries. There was a steno pool. Very few women had major jobs. There were a few who were lobbyists. So I just want to give to you kind of that understanding. The big change occurred during the mid-1970s. In 76, Roseanne Vuitch became the first female senator. That was huge, because look at when we started our state, it was in 1850, and now we're here in 1976 for the first woman. Also, you had during the 77 session, there was a total of 6 women in the legislature at this time, and that was huge for back then, because most of the time it was 3, or 1. Pauline Davis was the only female representative for 10 years. It just gives you an idea. Sexual harassment was very rampant during that time period. Again, what I've said, women had no protection and no structure in place to deal with the harassment issues. And I have 3 stories to tell you about that. When I was working in the legislature, there were, what I did every morning is I went up to the third floor, our office was on the second floor, to get the mail. And staff was allowed in the elevator before 9 o'clock, the members' elevator. So it was very easy for me because there was a lot of mail. And the elevator was just around the corner from our office. So one day, when I went into the elevator, I knew the gentleman who, they were not automatic elevators back then.
Okay.
So there was a gentleman who was, manually.
Cranking the elevator.
You got it. And so somebody else came on while I was on, and he said, "Do you mind if I take her to the top?" I said, "No, of course, whatever works for you." So she gets out, he closes the door, he then drops down a short distance and stops the elevator, gets out of the seat that he's sitting in, and gives me a bear hug. He was a huge gentleman. Gives me a bear hug, and I was really freaked out.
Yeah.
Because I'd never had anything happen like that in my life. And so what happened, I said, as pleasantly as I could, I said, "Please take me down to the third floor. I need to get out of here."
Yeah.
I never went in the elevator again. I walked up the stairs because I was scared.
Yeah.
I was scared. And then I had an incident with a member of the assembly. And he was elected, and he, I don't know why he picked on me, but he'd come into our office. The offices were very small back then. He'd come into the office, and I'd be on the phone, and he'd start kissing my neck.
Oh my God.
And I said to him, I said, "Leave me alone. I'm married. Just leave me alone." He would not listen to me. He did this repeatedly. I went to my boss, Jerry Lewis. Jerry talked to him. He would not stop. And then one day, what happened, we had Xerox machines, but they were all in the hallways.
Okay.
Individual offices did not have that back then. So I was Xeroxing, and he came up from behind me and kind of grabbed me. But what was really awful, there was a female member who was there and said, "Take that in, that's for the evening." Well, I felt completely violated because this wasn't anything that I was doing.
Yeah.
And I had decided I couldn't stand it anymore. And I had come home that day, and I had told Steve that I was going to quit because of this harassment from a member.
Yeah.
And he said, "Don't do anything yet. I want to have a talk with him." So the next morning, as a journalist, he was allowed on the floor until sessions started. And he came in and went on the floor, and he went up behind the member and said, "I understand you're harassing my wife." At which point, according to my husband, he turned around really fast and was very surprised about this. And he said, "I'll never do that again." And he never did. Actually, he asked me one time if I wanted to take a job in his office, and I said, "No, no way." But anyway, that's what a lot of women had to go through. So, but it all started changing, like I said, starting in the mid-'70s and definitely going to the '80s as more and more women were elected. And then there were things put in place where women could go and say, "Look, I'm having a problem with this person. Will you take care of it?"
Okay.
So things were evolving, but it was hard going through it at the time.
I imagine it was hellish going through.
It was. It was.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, I felt sorry for a lot of other people too. But I was very fortunate to have a husband who was a journalist, and that made the member realize that he wasn't going to get away with this anymore.
Go Steve. Go Steve on that one. Wow. What were your responsibilities when you started working for Lewis, going to a slightly lighter topic
Yes.
after that? Wow.
Yeah, I was the secretary.
Okay.
I helped with writing letters to the constituents. I also dealt with the press. And I also, what I really always felt good at was helping our constituents point them in the right direction if they were having a problem with one of the divisions of California government. And so that's what I would always do, is find out who exactly do they call. So it was really refreshing, and I was learning all the time.
It sounds like a research intensive.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was very interesting.
That is really cool. So a lot of work with the public as you were.
Yes, and I enjoyed it.
All right.
Yes.
That is so cool. So you found that part really fulfilling?
Yes.
So with Steve in the media business, what was your perception of the legal risks that reporters were facing in the 1970s? I mean, he was a great shield for you, but
Yes,
my
yes.
understanding is he didn't have that good of a shield.
It was interesting. There had always been tension between journalists and the courts.
Okay.
And, the job of reporters was basically to inform the public and often face legal pressures to reveal their confidential sources.
Okay.
And many times those confidential sources, they were used to uncover waste in government and corruption. Many stories would never have seen the light of the day without source protection. So Jerry saw the Shield Law as not protection for journalists,
Okay.
but protection for the public's right to know.
Okay.
And that was very important to him.
Okay.
Yes,
So the Evidence Code 1070, the Shield Law, was protection for the public,
yes.
not protection for the journalists.
Right, so much.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So, but at the time of the 70s, there was a lot going on
Yes.
with Evidence Code 1070.
Yes.
And can you tell me more about that, a little bit about Bagley's 1972 amendment
Yes.
and some of the things going on?
Yes, the Shield Law had
Okay.
actually been on the books. It had
Okay.
been for decades and protected journalists
Okay.
from confidential sources, being compelled to release the confidential sources
Okay.
to a judge and the legislature and the administrative bodies. Assemblyman Bagley expanded that to include grand juries,
Okay.
but unfortunately, it didn't really solve the problem.
Okay.
And that's because some courts felt that a defendant's constitutional right to a fair trial trumped a simple legislative statute.
Okay.
So that's what we were dealing with.
Okay.
Yes,
Is the courts just saying, no, the defendant's right is more important
Exactly.
than the public's right to know and the reporter's ability to protect the source?
exactly.
Okay. So Bagley strengthened it to include grand juries?
Yes, but
Okay.
unfortunately, the strengthening wasn't enough.
Okay.
It was a great step, but it wasn't enough.
Okay.
Yes.
So in light of it not being enough,
Mm-hmm.
in 1972, Lewis asked you to draft a constitutional amendment
Yes.
that would put Evidence Code 1070 into the California Constitution. What prompted this?
Well, this is really interesting. This is more than
Okay.
40 years ago, and I
Okay.
still remember it vividly, as it was, a week ago. It was Monday, November 27th,
Okay.
1972. There was a floor session that day,
Okay.
and word had started to spread around on the floor that Bill Farr of the Los Angeles Times
Okay.
had been jailed. And Jerry called from the floor
Can you tell me why Bill Farr was jailed?
for refusing to reveal the source.
Okay. All right.
And so the judges decided that.
Okay.
So Jerry called me. He was really upset about Farr.
Okay.
And his exact words were, "This is wrong. Find out how to fix it."
Wow. All right.
So what we did back then,
Okay.
you went to legislative council,
Okay.
who were the legislature's attorneys.
Uh-huh.
And I was told at that time that the only way to fix this problem, or the Farr problem, was to enact a constitutional amendment making equal rights for both sides. So it was huge.
So equal rights for the courts and the defendant's right and
Yes.
the rights of the reporters to
Yes,
protect their sources.
exactly.
Okay. Wow. So the
Yes.
legislative analyst said it has to be a constitutional amendment.
Yes,
Wow.
yes.
And so what was your next step then?
Well, going to Ledge Council helped.
Okay.
They explained to me what we needed to do, and I started doing all the preparing.
Okay.
And Jerry was really great because what he did, he showed me. I'd worked there for a year. He had confidence in me,
Okay.
and it really makes you feel good as a staff person. And I always felt a sense of pride when Jerry, gave me something to do, and he had, thought that he thought that I could do it, and it challenged me. I figured, well, if he thinks I can do this, I can do it.
So it was a big change, but because of Jerry's confidence in you?
Yes,
Wow.
yes,
That is so cool.
yes. I mean, it was very interesting.
Uh-huh.
Very interesting times again because the legislature was in session almost the full year. So you worked a lot with your boss.
Uh-huh.
I mean, they went home for the weekends. It was usually a Monday through Thursday session.
Okay.
But it was just fascinating because we spent a lot of time together as well.
Uh-huh. So
Yes.
he was really kind of mentoring you through the
Oh,
process,
yes.
it sounds
Oh,
like, too.
yes.
Yeah.
He was.
What are some of the things he pointed out as you were going through?
Oh,
doing it?
I mean, it was basically, how to get the right information,
Okay.
how to do how you do your job, what you're looking to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yes, he always tried to challenge the staff and, wanted to help us learn.
Okay. So, for those who are not familiar with the process of getting a bill through, especially a constitutional amendment, can
That's
you
right.
describe a little bit of some of the steps that Jerry walked you through with that bill in more detail and what the process would entail for your amendment?
What he did
Okay.
said he wanted to enact a shield law
Okay.
that would carry constitutional weight.
Okay.
That was the most important thing. And in early 1973, we introduced the first bill
Okay.
for Bill Farr.
Okay.
That was the first time, because the end of 1972, it was too late
All right.
to do anything in December. So we waited. We were ready to go the first of the year. We had the bill ready to go.
Uh-huh.
There is a process for this constitutional amendment.
Okay.
It first would go to the Assembly Judiciary Committee.
All right.
Then it would go to the Assembly floor, where you needed a 2/3 vote.
Okay.
Same thing happened in the Senate. Go to the Senate Judiciary, and then go to the floor for votes, 2/3.
Okay.
The bill did come up early on in 73
Okay.
for the Assembly Judiciary Committee.
Uh-huh.
There were 11 members. We needed 6 votes,
Okay.
but we lost.
What?
Yep, we did the first time around. And the second time around, in 1975, we fell short. And it was interesting, this wasn't a partisan issue.
Okay.
You had Dems and Reaps oppose it,
Uh-huh.
and Dems and Reaps support it.
Okay.
So it was very interesting.
So you said both sides were opposing
Mm-hmm.
or agreeing. What were their objections?
For newspaper people, they were very concerned that they may lose at the polls, and that could make matters worse. That was very, to the media, there was a lot of concern about this. Journalists also did not provide a united front on this. Some supported and felt free flow of information was being restricted. So, and many people said the First Amendment should be sufficient.
Okay.
So these were the things that were being talked about, but Jerry, he refused to alter the bill because he recognized, while it would be a tough battle, he said he would fight until we could change the law. He believed that the freedom of the press is one of our most important rights, and therefore would not water down the measure. He was
Interesting.
adamant about that. He also believed that jailing a journalist because he protected his information is an assault not only on the press, but the American people as well. He was very passionate about this.
Interesting.
And I think, one of the reasons that he liked my being involved was because he knew Steve was a reporter, and so I had the passion as well. So it was very interesting.
That is, wow. In the manuscript collection you donated, there are a lot of letters to and from the press, probably talking about this issue. Can you tell me some of the concerns they expressed to you, in addition to the concerns that were going on with the committee?
Well, I think, again, because you look at some of the newspapers, Sacramento Bee was against it, Los Angeles Times was against it. Many people felt it wasn't worth the risk. That's what a lot, and I can understand, because the fear was, if this did not pass, would journalists be in a worse position than they currently were? So there was a lot of, yes, you can see that. Yes, there's no question about it. So what we needed to do was to keep them informed on what we were doing. And we did do that. Jerry, spoke to a lot of people all the time to keep them apprised of what we were doing and why we were doing it.
So it was a really big risk
Yes.
for them in
Yes.
many ways.
Yes.
So Lewis, you mentioned, refused to alter the bill. He wanted it in its entirety to go through.
Yes.
So that is really cool, and also that turned it into a bit of a challenge. How did the prosecution of the Fresno 4 reporters in 1976 change the trajectory?
This was really interesting.
Okay.
We had failed in 73 and 75. And then
Okay.
September of 1976, the 4 journalists from the Fresno Bee, they were sent to jail for refusing to reveal their confidential sources. I was convinced that the jailing of more reporters helped coalesce the support for our third try. Because this was September of 76, we knew we were coming back at the beginning of the 1977 session. And it was very interesting because I brought something that I thought would be interesting to read. This is a press release. I save things from September 15th, 1976. And I'm going to read to you what Jerry said in here. Because the newsman's protection is a statute, judges have at times seen fit to ignore it, believing that they have a right to control proceedings in their own courts. Such was the case in the jailing of the Fresno 4 and the celebrated William Farr incident. Therefore, the only way to completely protect newsmen is to write the Shield Law into the state constitution, making it impossible for judges to disregard legislative intent.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. So that particular quote in talking about just how important it was, and he had a real groundswell that he was addressing with the
Yes.
Fresno 4 situation.
Yes, because that came out as a surprise. I mean, all of a sudden you had a second thing occur within, not a long period of time. And so the question was, is this going to continue in the future?
Continue to snowball and
Yes.
erode the protections
Exactly.
that were in place.
Exactly.
Interesting. So in 1977, the bill came up again, went
Yes.
to the Judiciary Committee for the third time.
Yes.
And obviously you have things like that press release kind of building support. What
Yes.
were some of the other steps you took to build support for this bill?
Well, this was really interesting because I had gone to Jerry and I said, you know what? Because we knew this hearing was coming. I said, why don't we write to Walter Cronkite, John Chancellor, and Howard K. Smith?
Could
And
you
ask,
remind the public, who are these folks?
these were key broadcasters
All right.
on CBS, NBC, and ABC.
Okay.
And this was a big deal.
Yeah.
And, Jerry agreed. I said, I think we should ask them to come. He says, yeah, let's do that. So we did. And you have to go back in time and realize there was no cable television. There was few independent televisions. 90% of all primetime viewing came out on the 3 networks that I just mentioned, CBS, NBC, and ABC. So it was very different than television today. So these anchors were highly respected. Walter Cronkite was named as the most trusted man in America. So it was very interesting.
I've heard of Walter Cronkite, but yes.
Yes. And so Jerry agreed about writing to them, and while their schedules would not allow them to be able to take a trip to California, they all wrote us letters.
Wow.
And getting over here, this was from Walter Cronkite. I'm not going to read the whole thing, just the important parts. Why can't the American people see that freedom of the press is not some privilege extended to a favored segment of the population, but is purely and simply their own right to be told what their government and its servants are doing in their name? The press cannot do that job unless it is free to protect its sources, it is as simple as that. So the members of the Assembly Judiciary Committee had all the letters that were written by the three gentlemen. And this time, we got it out of the Senate, the Assembly, excuse me, the Assembly Judiciary Committee with no votes to spare.
Wow.
Yes.
So it was still tight, even.
Oh, it was tight the whole time. Yes. Yes. But these letters, I've kept them all these years because, I mean, I turned them over to you, but at the same time, these were really something to kind of gave you goosebumps when you opened them and started reading them.
Yeah, reading those letters when I was going through
Yes.
the collection.
Yes.
Did they tip were they what tipped the balance, do you think, or was it FAR or a combination? The Fresno 4, a combination of the two?
I think it may have been a combination, but I think that the three nationwide journalists, they really had an impact on other people as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they were bringing this issue to the forefront.
That is so
Yes.
really cool. Okay. So later in 1977, the bill stalled again.
Yes.
This time on the assembly floor.
Yes.
Who tipped the balance in the voting and why?
Well, we needed 54 votes
Okay.
because it was a constitutional amendment.
So that 2/3 majority.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Many newspapers were still opposed. You had the Santa Monica Evening Outlook, and they again believed that the risk outweighs the benefits. So this was very important. And the Sacramento Bee opposed. But this was very interesting because there was one missing vote as in the chambers because Charlie Warren had taken a job, Assemblyman Charlie Warren had taken a job with the Carter administration. And on June 21st, 1977, Mike Roos won a special election to replace Warren. Now, that was a stroke of luck for us.
Okay.
Because 2 days after the election, Roos was sworn in. But he and Jerry had known each other when they were in the Coro Foundation.
So they were close friends.
They were friends. It was a leadership program. So Jerry approached Mike Roos on the floor, explained the bill, and Roos offered his support. So Roos became the 54th vote. And it was the deciding vote that put the measure over the top and moved the proposal to the Senate.
So that relationship was key.
Yes, I mean, we talked to Mike Roos recently about this because I wanted to get all the details of what went on on that day. And here's the other interesting thing. Assembly Speaker Leo McCarthy, he opposed the bill. And he went up to Roos and he said, "Are you sure you want to do this?"
Okay.
And Roos told McCarthy, he's the Speaker of the House. He controls who's on the committees and everything.
Correct.
Roos said, "I gave Jerry my word. I don't break it on my first day here."
Good for him.
Yes, I always liked him, but I remember vividly what he did that day.
That's a lot of integrity.
Yes,
there.
isn't it? Yes.
Really cool. Okay, so having read some of the back and forth that was going on, it looks like in addition to groups like the Sacramento Bee, League of Women Voters was opposed to the legislation. What were the reasons and concerns, and how did you and Lewis work to address concerns outside of the concerns that the press had?
Well, California's Constitution is one of the longest in the world.
I know, it's impressive.
It's very impressive, but that's what concerned the League of Women Voters. They thought it was too large and cumbersome, and they were opposed to adding anything to the Constitution. They said they would only support a legislative remedy, and they refused to change their position. So, that's where they were coming from.
Mm-hmm.
That's fine. But, we moved forward. We knew that we weren't going to get any support with them, and so we continued doing what we believed needed to be done to get this bill approved.
So you
Or
kept
constitutional
on
amendment.
pushing
We kept on pushing
Okay.
the whole time.
So what other challenges were associated with shepherding this bill through the assembly? Obviously, that final vote was a big one.
Yes.
the opposition was a big one. What were some of the other challenges?
Well, just counting votes. Also, because we knew it was going to be tight, what if somebody isn't there on the day that you're taking the vote? It was, somebody could switch. So Jerry, he always talked to the members, kept them involved, made sure they were still on board. So he worked at that very hard because he truly believed in this.
So he kept the connection going
Yes.
as it was moving through.
Yes.
Okay.
And that was very important to keep people involved and to make certain that this passed because we had such a narrow pathway
Thin
with
margin.
everything. Yes, the margin was not great.
When one vote is what's
Yes.
turning it. Yeah.
Yes.
So the bill went to the Assembly, to the Senate after passing in the Assembly. Who took charge of it then? And did you assist that person in any way?
Well, there is a gentleman, there is a person that always kind of jockeys a member of the Assembly that bill through the Senate. And we asked Senator Al Song, and he was a Democrat from Southern California. He had carried another bill on press freedom. So he was our logical choice.
Perfect fit.
And he, to be the Senate member, he argued the bill, and we worked very closely with him on the logistics on this. And, I give him a lot of credit how he got this out of the Judiciary Committee in the Assembly. Excuse me, the Senate.
So when you say there were a lot of logistics you worked on with him, can you give me some examples of some of the types of logistics that you deal with?
Well, it's keeping your supporters there to vote for you, to make sure that they're still agreeing with you. You don't want to be surprised at a committee hearing or a floor vote of something going on that you weren't aware of. We kept a lot of information going out to the different members, what was going on, what we were looking for, what we were hoping to do, so that it kept people interested. And of course, members were changing. You had, in 1976, you had new people appear in the legislature, but we tried to stay on top of this. And again, Jerry was very, very committed to this. And I think that commitment is what made the difference because he was always available should we need something on the law. So, it was very helpful.
Yeah, just keeping it in people's faces. Okay.
Yes.
So in May of 1970,
Can I just tell you I've
Please.
got one other story to tell you.
Let's.
This was a press release that came out in July of 1978. And again, in going back through everything, this really showed me Jerry's passion. It was fascinating to me. So this is all his quotes. This case is just another example in a long line of attempts by the judiciary to erode the protection of the Newsman Shield Law, which says that the judiciary cannot hold an individual in contempt for refusing to divulge the name of a confidential source. In 1972, it was William Farr, and in 1976, it was the Fresno Four. Now, a Sacramento judge is saying that the legislature cannot tell the judiciary what the court should and should not consider actions of contempt. By elevating the Newsman Shield Law to the state constitution, however, the judiciary would be unable to ignore the wishes of the legislature and the people of California.
that is awesome.
Yes. Yeah, Jerry kept up with it. He kept,
Ongoing support.
oh yeah, he kept me busy.
I bet. Really busy. So you said Song was able to get the bill through the Senate Judiciary Committee, but then in May of 1978, the amendment failed in the Senate.
Yes.
What was that day like for you?
Oh, it was very disappointing. Again, we'd been working on this. We were coming up, on 5 years of this. And
Long time.
and again, also, the most important thing is we believed we were doing the right thing. Doing the right thing to prevent people from being jailed when they shouldn't have been. So yes, that part was disappointing. But we got reconsideration. So there was that little light of possibility.
Hanging thread.
Yeah, hanging
Potential.
thread, yes.
Potential. So you said it was granted reconsideration.
Yes.
And it eventually got scheduled for a second floor vote in August of
Yes.
78.
Yes.
What was that second vote like for you?
Well, it was amazing. The measure passed. Got the 27.
Wow.
Got the 27 votes in the Senate, the bare minimum.
How did that happen?
You know, I'm not even sure. I think, again, from my point of view, I think it was Jerry just coming back and explaining things. It wasn't a one-time, this is why I'm supporting this. He did it all the time. He went in when issues came up, which I just read to you, that was a newer issue. He had things to say, and it really made a difference. And he kept it in the forefront for the people.
Okay.
And he just did not give up. You know, we were thrilled when this was passed. Unfortunately, it was passed in August of 1978, and therefore we knew that it wasn't going to go on the 78 ballot.
That's
It would be going on the it would go on in the June ballot in 1980. So that was a little bit of a disappointment because it was like, oh, it's not over yet. We have to keep working this.
Right, because you still
Yes,
had to get
we
it
still
through.
had to do it. You know,
Oh, man.
yeah. I mean, it would have been perhaps easier if it was in May of 78, but it didn't really matter because it got on the ballot, and that's what we really wanted.
So even though it was going to take more time.
Yes.
So did you do anything to celebrate that day in August?
I think what it was a sigh of relief. I mean, it was really, wow, we stuck with this. We did this.
So you and Steve didn't go out to dinner? There was no
Oh.
party in the office?
No, I mean, I think we were all happy. But it was towards the end of session, and, you know, we kept this. This is what we wanted. But we knew right off the bat, I know you celebrate a little bit, but we knew that we had then
More work cut out for
more
you.
work cut out for us because now it's going to be on the ballot. And the interesting thing is, of course, it was a difficult 6-year period, but we won every vote in the committee and on the floor by the thinnest of margins.
I don't envy you on that one. That would have been super stressful. That really tight margin.
The other thing just to bring up why there was a little disappointment, Jerry was running for Congress in November of 78. So we knew he'd be back in DC, you know, when the ballot in the voters for June of 1980, it meant that Jerry may not be as actively involved because he was a member of Congress.
Yeah, that would be a real challenge.
Yes.
So how did that change the public campaign for the 1980 ballot with Jerry not as active in the picture and it being that 2-year chunk of time there?
But you're right about that. But at the same time, Jerry, what I did when he went to Congress, and I still worked in the legislature, I spent time on the weekends, and Jerry and I would talk. What do we need to do next? What information should we get out there? So, you know, we kept going. But he was very dynamic with things. And so, you know, we knew it was going to be a problem. But some newspapers started to flip. The McClatchy newspaper flipped, and the Los Angeles Times flipped as well.
Awesome.
Yes, because now it was on the ballot. And they knew that they had no choice, the media, but to strongly support its passage. And they asked voters to send a message against government abuse and secrecy that only a free press can provide.
So you were working weekends to make this happen.
Oh, yeah, well, yes, because I was working in the legislature for somebody else, and I felt that I didn't want to mix the work. But yes, and Jerry and I would talk on the weekends. It was perfect.
That is, wow.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, I was very lucky, you know, of the people who I worked for in the legislature. Yes.
And so a lot of the papers you said were flipping. So
Yes.
McClatchy, the LA Times.
Yes.
They were putting out press releases basically saying support this bill?
They were saying things good about the bill where they hadn't in the past. They saw that if it loses, they're going to lose. That wasn't our intention. Our intention was always to correct this, but people had different ways of looking at it. But they understood that if this went down, it would hurt them ultimately. And you know, this was really interesting because this was an extremely low budget campaign. There was no TV, no radio, no direct mail, no polling. We had no idea where we stood with the public. I mean, it was fascinating. And again, as I've mentioned, the campaign really depended upon the media coverage of this issue.
So the press getting behind the bill
Yes.
when it hit the ballot was key.
Yes, but we had a really big break because there was no organized opposition to the proposal. There were no opposition arguments in the ballot pamphlet. And so we had framed Prop 5 as a method to help journalists root out corruption in government, and that was hard to argue against it.
That would make it extremely hard to argue
Exactly.
against it.
So that gives you an idea of you know, how we did this without Jerry. And I mean, obviously, for what we were trying to do, to have no opposition was very helpful.
Yeah. So no budget, no Jerry.
Right.
I'm not sure you could throw in any other major challenges, but were there any other major challenges you guys hit?
You know, no, not really. I mean,
those two were more than enough.
They were more than
That
enough.
2-year
Yes,
lag.
yes. But I mean, it was very interesting because I mean, what happened here is that I mean, this was something that the people were really interested in, and I really believe that that's made a difference in California.
It has.
Yes.
So how do you feel personally looking back on this journey?
I feel very fortunate to have been part of it. You had to be patient. You had to be focused. There's no question about that. And you had to be determined.
Very determined.
Yes, because you just didn't want to throw up your hands and say, well, we can't do it. That was never said. And all the times with the not winning, et cetera, we never talked about hanging it up. We knew we were going to try again. I think there was a lot of frustration when opponents called this a special privilege for the press. That was not the case. It was to make certain that the public got all the information that they needed. And we were glad that the voting public felt the same way. I mean, we were very lucky. And I spent 40 years in public policy, and this was one of the most important and successful measures that I was ever involved with.
Wow.
Yeah. And there were some. I mean, I did campaign finance reform. I was involved with some really interesting things.
Major issues.
Yeah, but this was really something. I think because it took us so long, and we had to keep kind of, you know, staying on top of things.
It was a fight.
It was a fight. There's no question about it. And again, you look back to Mike Roos taking Warren's position. We were so lucky we got that bill out of the assembly.
Yeah.
When we did, because I don't know if we would have been able to do it.
Speaking of that, do you think this amendment would pass today?
I'm not sure. I'm really not. Things have changed dramatically in the past 30 plus years. Even more than that, 40 plus years. Oh my goodness.
We're not talking about it.
In 1980, it passed with 73% of the vote, which was huge. Again, we were surprised when it passed. Today, it's more polarized. The media is a target. It's an institution being undermined for political advantage. And some politicians need a foil, and to some, the media is their target. I am actually encouraged by one thing. On the federal level, in Congress, there is a National Press Act, which would be a national law protecting reporters from having to reveal confidential sources. That has passed the House, but it's in the Senate.
Is that Kylie's bill?
Yes.
Okay. Very cool. So it's in the Senate and
Yes.
going through the process?
Yes,
and
yes,
see
we
what
hope.
happens.
Yes,
Yeah,
but we're hoping because this is very important.
it's huge.
Yes, it is huge.
Very cool. So this amendment had a fairly immediate effect
Yes.
on press cases in California, as your
Yes.
collection shows, actually.
Yes.
Have the cases thus far adhered to the intent of this amendment, or were there rulings that Lewis would have disagreed with?
Well, it's interesting because I'm going to kind of turn this over to Jerry and his thoughts. He passed away 41 years after the Shield Law. It was very sad when that happened. When the Shield Law was placed in the Constitution, there have been a few incidences in California where the Shield Law has been circumvented. In 1990, for example, the state Supreme Court ruled that some criminal defendants can force disclosure of unpublished notes if they can show that it would help their case.
Is that the Delaney case you're referring to?
I believe so, yes. A freelance video blogger was jailed because he wasn't considered a member of the press. But overall, I really do think that Jerry would be pleased with the results.
Good.
Yes,
That is really good. to
Yes.
hear. So, did you stay in contact? Obviously, you did because you were calling him on the weekends. But when he left for Washington,
we were good friends. I knew his wife very well. He knew Steve. We were friends. And actually, in the 80s, we went to Washington, D.C. 5 times.
5 times.
Yeah, well, Steve also covered all the inaugurations. So when he went for the inaugurations, I went, and I was with Jerry and his wife Arlene. So
All right.
it was very nice. Actually, I just have a really funny story to tell you. When I was in his office one time, Steve was working, and I was there in the office. I was in his inner office, and Roger Mudd, a CBS journalist, came in the office, and Jerry introduced me to Mudd as his daughter.
Wow.
It was just that was his personality. But yes, we spent many times, and then we took our son, and when he got older, Steve and I went and played in D.C., but our son worked for 3 weeks for Jerry in his office.
So you had a 3-week vacation
Yes.
while your son was working.
Yes, but he learned a lot, and so it was really nice. And Jerry was always a caring person, and yes, we stayed in contact. We saw one another, we talked to one another, always called on his birthday, things like that. I was very fortunate.
That is so cool. It's
Yeah.
good that there was that friendship
Yes.
there. So,
Yes.
for so long. All right. So you kept in contact with Lewis, but at the same time in 1979, you'd gone to work for Ross Johnson.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, Ross was Jerry's district director. So as soon as I started with Jerry, I knew Ross. I mean, I'd talk to Ross at least once a day. He was primarily in the district office down in San Bernardino while we were up here in Sacramento. I think, if I recall correctly, but as I told you, it's 40 years ago plus, I think Ross interviewed me before Jerry did.
Oh, really?
Yes, I think that Ross did some of the initial interviews and then told Jerry people to call back.
So he was on your initial panel
Yes.
several years
Yes,
prior.
yes. Now in '78, as I mentioned, Jerry ran for Congress, and then Ross ran for the Assembly from Orange County. And Jerry had asked my husband and I to go back to D.C. with him, but we declined. There was a whole variety of reasons. All the family was out here on the West Coast. It was going to be difficult. But when Jerry went back east, Ross called me to come and work for him because he knew me.
Right,
So
he knew your work.
he knew my
you were
work.
Fantastic. He's like, I want you. That is really cool. So what was it like to switch positions? And obviously you were still working weekends on the Newsman's Shield Law. So that kind of in-between phase when the law hadn't passed, and did you feel like you were split in any way?
Well, I only did that on weekends. I was very careful about that. I was working for Ross, so I had to focus on his issues. Again, I volunteered to use my own time to do writing on Prop 5 and doing what I could do to help get it passed.
Okay.
Yes.
So it was very much a weekend. I'm not even thinking about this at work.
Right. But there wasn't, the campaign again wasn't one of this where we had to raise money or
Right.
we had to do a variety of things. It was just kind of keeping this in the people's minds, that this is an issue that's going to come up on the ballot and you need to know what's in it and why it's important.
So you mentioned that you were really, during the week, it was Ross. What legislation do you consider most important from your time working with Ross Johnson?
We worked on campaign finance reform.
Campaign finance
Yes.
reform. Okay.
Ross had to limit the amount of money that people could give to candidates. And what happened was that Ross had an initiative on the ballot in the 1980s that would restrict the amount of money that people could give to candidates. And it had, you could increase that amount every 2 years or whatever, but now you could not do anything. You couldn't do it across the board. You couldn't do that. But it was very interesting. It was only in effect for about a year and a half. The court,
Really?
yeah, the courts ruled against it and took it off.
Was it as much of a fight to get that one passed as the Shield Law?
Very different,
Very
because
different.
it was Shield Law was over a 6-year or 8-year period. This was over. Ross had introduced it, if I recall correctly. It was in the mid-1980s, and then it went to the vote of the people. The issue of campaign finance money did continue, and I can bring it up now. In 2000, Ross co-authored a bill with Senator John Burton, and there was something that was put on the ballot and passed by the people and still in effect that limits
Cool.
the amount of money that people can give you directly.
Cool.
Yes.
That's-
It was very important because otherwise the amount of money that was being spent in California was really a shock. And it affects all the constitutional officers as well as members of the Assembly and the Senate.
very cool.
Yes.
That's really fascinating. So you eventually became Ross Johnson's chief of staff.
Yes.
And for those in the audience who aren't necessarily versed with the workings of the interior workings of the legislature, what does a chief of staff do?
Well, you kind of make sure the train is running on time.
Okay.
You would oversee the legislation, media relations, constituent relations. You would coordinate the workings of the office. You wanted the office to work well, to do the job that we were supposed to do. And so we work. All of the people that I worked for and with were wonderful. I mean, we all came together to do things. And we all knew kind of what we were best at in the office.
Mm-hmm.
And so that also was very helpful.
So you were in charge of the office, it sounds like. in
I
many
guess
ways.
so, yeah.
So that sounds like a big deal for anyone. But how common was it for a woman? And did you encounter any pushback?
It was in the 60s and the 70s, it was extremely rare for women. By the 80s and 90s, it was far more common. Female legislators, female lobbyists, female reporters. I mean, this was really a big change, and it started, like I said, in the mid-70s, but continued into the 80s. As a matter of fact, a women's caucus was created in the legislature in 1985, the mid-1980s. And that tells you how the number of women was gradually increasing.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, I was doing some reading last night and read that there may be, I know I'm jumping far ahead, but there may be more women picking up seats this year. And
Interesting.
yeah, very, very interesting indeed.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't encounter a lot of pushback?
No,
it
I
sounds
did not at that time. And a lot of that had to do with your boss. And when you had a good boss, your boss protected you.
Sounds like Ross was a good guy to work
He was an excellent guy to work for. It's very sad to me because both Jerry and Ross are gone, and they were wonderful people. I felt so lucky because they cared about their staff, they cared about the people, and we did things to help the constituents. That's what we were there for, to to help them when there were bad problems and nobody would help them solve them. That's what we were there for.
That is so awesome. That is really cool, both that they were so protective of you guys and
Yes.
really supporting their constituents.
Yes, yes,
That's amazing.
yes.
So what would you consider the most significant change you saw in the legislature during your time there?
The rise of women. As I mentioned earlier, when I was first there were 3 women. In 1976, as I also mentioned, Roseanne Vuitch became the first female senator, which was just huge. Other things like included in 1990, Californians approved term limits. And a lot of the entrenched male lawmakers, they were booted out and they were replaced by women. So this was in the 1990s when term limits was first put into place. It was passed by the voters. So the 92 election would have been when it was first put into place. In the 1970s, as I mentioned earlier, there was sexual harassment and there was nowhere for women to go. Now, with women in power, you know, it's very different because, yes, women are protected nowadays.
Which is
Very
awesome.
important,
Yeah.
yes, very important.
So you started seeing a lot of change with that term limit. It
Yes.
sounds like in addition to the general rise, but the term limit kind of
Yes.
sped it up a little.
And what you saw also, which was very interesting, you'd see that a lot of women were first running in local races before they went up to the legislature to run. So it was fascinating. I mean, you now have, it's very interesting, we have where there are 2 women running against one another in many campaigns.
I love it.
Yes,
That is
yes,
yay.
yes.
So cool.
I mean, in all honesty, what's happening is the women are getting closer to the 50% numbers in the legislature.
Good.
Yes.
So I'm dying to know. I might have found an article in Wired that talked about the electronic voting machine that failed in a very high-profile test you ran. What prompted the electronic voting machine test? And did you know that the machine would fail?
No, I didn't at all. What had happened is there was this new touch screen technology.
This was in like the early 2000s.
Thousands,
right?
yes, exactly. And there were concerns, legitimate concerns, that there could be glitches. And then what do? You have no proof. So what happened is this one company, they had contacted us, and they were very interested with their touchscreen technology. And what happened is they said, we'll come in and show you, demonstrate it for you. So I asked one of my colleagues in the office, I said, come with me, let's do it together. I don't want to be the only one there because, you know, there could be somebody saying, well, no, that's not what happened. I said, I want to have a witness kind of thing. Yes. So the gentleman who was the representative from the voting machine company, he had me vote. And there was a paper copy, but it didn't match what I had voted for on the machine. And so, I mean, it was very interesting. This isn't what we were looking for. We were looking to make sure that it was safe. I mean, we weren't hoping that there were issues.
You were just running a straight test.
We were running a straight test. That was all. We followed exactly what the gentleman told us to do. And the Secretary of State then halted the machines until kinks were worked out and our paper trail legislation was passed. I mean, we all grew up with that. You know, with the paper trail, and then all of a sudden they wanted to make these big shifts, and then how do you check to see if it's correct? Could somebody have done something to the machines? And so all we did was ask for a little test. Oh my God, we had no knowledge that this was going to
go this way.
Right, or go that far.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what were kind of some of the outcomes of that as far as the paper trail legislation, basically?
Right,
Okay.
right, that we have that.
To back up.
Yes.
Okay. So after Ross was termed out of the legislature, he became chair of the state's Fair Political Practices Commission.
Yes.
And you went with him?
Yes, yes, he asked me to. And what he wanted me to do, which was really interesting to me, was to write reports on campaign finance and how money influences elections. And I was very, very interested in that because it just was right up my alley. We actually
Sounds very similar to some of the legislation from the 80s.
exactly, exactly. We actually ended up winning a national award, the ProPublica, for investigative work in the public interest. And this was the report on independent expenditures. And so
Wow.
I had worked on this.
Giant Gorilla in Campaign Finance. Love that subtitle.
Yes, it was really interesting. And so Ross, at his time at the FPPC, we had several hearings on money in the campaigns, et cetera. And it was one of those things. We all have things that we really enjoy doing, are just fascinated by. I was so lucky with the issues that I did through the years. And this kind of was a cap on my career. I did 2 more reports after this, but I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed being able to provide people with information so they knew what was going on as well.
So starting with press law and working through campaign finance,
I
the
know.
capstone of campaign finance, and now this collection. Wow.
Yes, I was very fortunate.
That is amazing. So you served on several other important boards in addition to that one.
Yes.
Can you tell me about some of these?
Well, for one, it's the IGS, which it's the Berkeley Institute for Governmental Studies. I enjoyed that since I had gone to college there. We, as board members, we raise funds to underwrite research projects for governance and public policy. It was, what happened is there would be a dinner once a year. It was for fundraising. We'd bring friends with us, and we had fabulous speakers about politics. I mean, it was absolutely interesting. So I felt very, very fortunate with that. I'm not on that board anymore, but I do serve on the board of directors of the Friends of California Archives, and
Awesome.
we work to educate Californians on the state's rich political history.
Which is an amazing history.
It is, and you know, it's really, it's nice. I think it is so important to preserve history and to make sure that people have access to it,
Access is critical.
isn't it?
It really
Yes.
is. Okay, so you and Steve co-wrote several books together, many of which are actually held by the State Library. What inspired you to write these books?
Well, it was.
And can you give me some of the titles for our
Oh yes. First of all, it was really interesting how we got involved in this. We were both kind of retired, and we were having lunch with our friends, and something came up, you know, about writing a book. They were in the same place we were, and we decided that between the 4 of us, we had 150 years of knowledge of having worked.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so we decided that it would work really well for the 4 of us, which we did. And this book was called Game Changers, 12 Elections That Transformed California. And we were very fortunate to win the California Historical Society Book Award on this. So
That's a pretty serious award.
it was really interesting what you learn, because a lot of the things that we felt, it wasn't always in the history books. And as a matter of fact, I went back to some of my history books from college days, and there were a lot of things that were left out of there, primarily dealing with women.
I can see that.
Yes. And then we also wrote 2 other books. One was called Paving the Way, Women's Struggle for Political Equality in California. And we would highlight the struggle of women, many who were lost to history. We were really surprised what we learned from women who had not been included in textbooks. It went from the gold rush to the present, and it was how women made a difference in the lives of Californians. So we really enjoyed these. And then what we did is we took the Paving the Way bill and turned it into a book called The Time Travelers, and it was written for middle schoolers. So
love
they would receive an education and know about women's history in California.
What was your favorite person to research for that book?
The person who I respected the most was Clara Foltz. She was an individual who, back in the 1870s, that she wanted to see that women would be able to be attorneys, and it was next to impossible
Really?
for women to be attorneys back then. And so she was able to get the governor of California to sign legislation allowing women to become lawyers. So she
How
had
did
it.
she manage that?
Well, on a night when he was signing all the bills, she managed to barge into the office and had him look at the bill, and he says, "This isn't so bad." So he signed it. And
Okay,
she's
then.
responsible for that, yes.
So she literally just passed it under his nose and said, "Sign here."
Yes.
Love it. That's
But he read it as well.
okay.
But this was important because otherwise women didn't have a shot at certain things. And so she made things very possible. And this was somebody who was left out of history. I mean, I've seen a lot of history books, and she's not in there, those books. These are California history books, and she's not in there. So it's always very interesting to me. So what else are we missing
Right.
in terms of women?
Seriously. So Bertie might have told me that your grandson is interning at the State Library and that he is seriously into history. I know that was your major in college.
Yes.
And obviously you've written several books on that. Was that passion for the past something you might have had a hand in?
Well, it's really interesting because really his first love is engineering and robotics, which is totally different from me and my husband. But he was on the Rio Americana robotics team. But he had a history teacher who really connected with him. And so his name is Eli. He would stop on his way home from school and quiz me about politics, about history, about things like that. So it was very, very interesting. And he's asked us a lot of very interesting questions about politics. And I'm happy to see, whatever he does, I'm happy to see that he has that interest in there.
Seriously?
Yes, because a lot of kids don't nowadays. And as my husband would say, he's read our books, and somehow he found them more interesting than Shakespeare.
I love it. That's great. They are good books,
Okay, thank
having
you.
looked at them. Looking back on your career so far, what is something you wish you had known at the beginning?
Well, that you can't change things too quickly. Everything takes time, and mostly change happens slowly. You know, many times when you're involved in something, we got to get this done, we're going to do this, it needs to be done, and you can't give up. Because as you saw with what we talked about, the SHIELD law, if we had given up, there wouldn't be a SHIELD law here in California. So you've got to keep going. And if the issue's important, it's worth sticking with it. And it's just, don't give up. The one thing that I do remember, I was very lucky when I worked in the legislature, you had Dems and Reaps work together. Yeah, of course they had heated debates on the floor, no question about it, but they often worked together. And I remember watching from the Senate floor, Senate President John Burton. He would often do a scathing speech on the Senate floor against Republicans.
Scathing.
Yes, and then he would walk over to the Republican leader, put a hand on his shoulder, and say, "Nothing personal."
Okay.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was really interesting. And, you know, chances were that perhaps the two of them would go out for a beer that night.
Love
Or
it.
something like that. So I liked where you see where the members could be of different parties, they could work together. It was just very important. And it's sad to me that we don't see that as much anymore.
If you had one bit of advice to give to journalists and others who care about the public's right to know, what would it be?
It would be vigilant, And remember who you are working for, not publishers and station owners, but the public. That's the most important thing.
Working for the public.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susie. This was fascinating.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to get a lot of this information out to people so they can see what needs to be done to make changes.
I really appreciate
you.
it, and we look forward to making this interview available to the public.
Thank you very much.